If you're interested in writing at all, you've probably heard the well-treaded and all too sensationalized stories of writers who struggled through this crappy job or through rejection after rejection until one day they become overnight best-selling book writers with movie deals and merchandising to boot. Stephen King, master of horror and possibly the most well-known contemporary novelist, struggled to make ends meet as a high school janitor among many other jobs before finally landing a book deal with Carrie. Or J.K. Rowling, who barely scraped by on Social Security as a single mother before finally publishing Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. And, well, that's great, and I don't want to take credit away from these authors, as I'm sure their conditions were difficult, but I think they've been talked to death in writing advice circles, and to me represent a sort of unrealistic expectation that if you struggle and work hard enough, you too could be just like them. But what about the writers that live and die in relative obscurity? Writers who aren't talked about outside of niche literary circles or a handful of fanatical readers. Today, I'd like to try to give credit and kudos to the lives and writings of just a few of literature's smaller voices. Clarence L. Cooper Jr. was an African-American crime novelist who lived and wrote through active drug addiction, prison cells, and around the back streets of New York. An author of 7 books, Cooper would never acclaim much notoriety or readership throughout most of his life, outside of pulp and noir circles. And sadly, his fiction was much more than any of that. Born in 1934 in Detroit, not much is known on his life aside from what could hazily be put together through police reports and pieces of his writing, so I'll do my best to relay the information I did find on him. In 1980, at the age of 26, Cooper would write and publish his first novel, The Scene. Using his first-hand experience as a heroin addict and frequenter of urban underground circles, Cooper would write a tale about the scene, a place where anything and everything could be sold or bought. This first book did reach some acclaim, though Cooper was hardly in a position to take advantage of this opportunity, as he was in prison at the time due to the difficulties dealing with drugs. As I mentioned, he was a long-time heroin addict. After this stint in prison, he would write 3 other novels, though these didn't receive the acclaim that The Scene did, mostly due to them being published in cheap pulp publications. Farther along, at the age of 32, Cooper again would be serving time in prison for a drug charge. While serving time here, he would write a book titled The Farm. Taking place in what was officially called the United States Public Service Hospital, though colloquially referred to as the U.S. Narcotics Farm, tells the story of a man named John as he serves his time at the farm, reflecting, like Cooper possibly was in real life, on the struggles and choices he'd gone through in his life, as well as a romantic connection with an addict named Sonia in the woman's wing of the facility. While this seems to be considered his most powerfully written book, it received hardly any notice on publication, except for in an all-black literary journal, who only left a raw and scathing review of the work. With the low performance of The Farm, Cooper would never publish again, and sadly, he would meet the end of his life broken alone on a YMCA at only the age of 44. Quote, disillusioned by the hostile response to his fiction, Cooper became increasingly alienated from those around him. He died penniless, strung out, and alone in New York City in 1978. In 1902, at the Theresian Military Academy in Austria, a young man by the name of Franz Kappes had recently discovered the poetry of Rainer Maria Rilke. Upon noticing him reading Rilke's poetry, the Academy's chaplain had told Franz that the Rilke had once been a student of his at another military academy, but didn't seem fit for military service. Since Rilke had eventually become a poet, this interested Franz as he was keener on becoming a poet than serving any career in the military, so he decided to send him a letter. This would be the start of a correspondence between the young poet and Rilke that would last until 1908, in which they would discuss and advise Franz on writing, religion, and existential questions, and life in general. Rilke's letters would eventually be collected and published by Kappes in the much-loved Letters to a Young Poet, without his own letters included. One of the questions that Kappes had originally went back and forth with in his correspondence with Rilke was that of pursuing either a military career or a literary one. He did eventually choose to continue with military schools and studies, going on to serve 15 years as a military officer. Even while working this military career, he did continue to write, though he never found much lasting literary success in his life, despite writing poetry, short stories, novels, and even screenplays. One of these screenplays, an adaptation of Kappa's own work, The Red Rider, would eventually be made into a 1923 silent film. It's no wonder a lot of his work has been forgotten though, as I can't even find copies or publications of any of his works, so it seems a lot of it may just be lost or put up in some library somewhere. Regardless, it seems mostly Kappas is known for Letters to a Young Poet, which he would be the one that collected the letters together and published. But outside of that, no one really reads any of his work.
A mystery disease known as the gay plague has become an epidemic unprecedented in the history of American medicine. That today from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. Topping the list of likely victims are male homosexuals who have many partners and drug users who inject themselves with needles. Medical experts say the disease kills 4 out of every 10 people it strikes and that it threatens to explode in the nation's cities.
The 1980s AIDS crisis was a health disaster that not only ultimately claimed the lives of over 100,000 people from 1981 to 1990, but also isolated and struck fear among people all across the world, especially those marginalized or members of the LGBT+ community. One of many people diagnosed with this terrible disease would be that of Tory Dent. In 1988, at the age of 30, Dent was diagnosed with HIV. That time, of course, there was no treatment, and most who got HIV died shortly after, with the average life expectancy being just 3 years after diagnosis. Dent survived with it past that average and went on to write about her feelings, experiences, and difficulties living with the disease. She was a prolific poet and AIDS activist, receiving numerous honors and awards in her lifetime, such as grants from the New York Foundation for the Arts, money for women / the Barbara Deming Memorial Fund, the Rona Jaffe Foundation, and 3 PEN American Center grants. Even with these awards, though, I don't see her poetry often talked about or discussed in literary circles, which is why I decided to put her on this list, as she's certainly not mainstream either. Her first collection of poems was titled What Silence Equals, which was her first poetic confession of how it felt living with HIV. Her second collection of poems, HIV Mon Amour, would even go on to win the 1999 James Laughlin Award. Sadly though, her third collection would be her last. Black Milk, which was published in 2005, would be the final culmination of her verse and dealt with the dreadful years of HIV treatment, hospital stays, and a furious depression. Just weeks after the publication of the collection, Black Milk, Dent would sadly pass away of AIDS-related complications in her New York apartment at the age of 47 years old. I think with Dent, she not only gave great representation of a woman living with HIV specifically, but also a poet giving keen insight in what it's like to live with a disability or chronic illness. The translucent infrastructure of IVs and oxygen tubes superimposed itself upon me, like a body double, more virulent and cold, like lid uppinned and broken by her swan, like the abandoned and organ failed regarding its superior soul ascend, so completely and successfully reconfigured within its technological construct. My body proper no longer existed. My vital signs highlighted in neon preceded the spiraling vortex of my interiority. The part of me people will say later that's what they loved when they roam about cramped rare book library of their memory for a couple of minutes and think of Tory. There is a fear I have that when I'm dead and gone, no one will remember I ever existed except for the small traces in the back of people's minds that will surely someday also fade, just as much as my physical, biological matter. Partially for me, writing is trying to stake a claim of immortality. If I can write out my views, feelings, thoughts, experiences, problems, sights, smells, etc., maybe there is hope that someone a couple 100 years from now in some far-off spacefaring colony of some kind will still be reading what I wrote and have themselves moved by it, even if it's just one person. I think that's what I was trying to accomplish with this video. To give life back into some writers who maybe aren't so well discussed. If you have any other obscure and neglected writers you think I should cover in another video, leave them down in the comments below, as I enjoy highlighting the lives and works of lesser known writers. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this video and you give it a like. If you want, you can also subscribe. I do videos on writing and literature about every month or so as my schedule permits. Anyways, hope you're doing well. I'll see you around.